David Washington was 44 years old, and he had built everything he owned with his own hands. Literally. The construction company, the commercial contracts, and the $10.2 million estate outside Atlanta that his wife of 14 years had just demanded in the divorce. She sat across from him, composed and rehearsed, backed by a high-powered attorney who also happened to be her lover, a man who had spent 6 months helping her engineer what they both believed was the perfect plan to leave David with nothing. What neither of them knew was that the house had never been hers to want. David had structured the ownership 4 years before he ever met her. Inside a private LLC his wife didn't fully understand, and her attorney had quietly decided to ignore. When she slid that demand across the table, David read it twice. Then he looked up. And he laughed. Not out of shock, not out of pain. Because in that moment, David Washington understood something his wife and her attorney had never once considered, that the man they spent 2 years trying to quietly destroy had been watching them the entire time. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The sun was still low when David Washington stepped out onto the back terrace. Atlanta hadn't woken up yet. The city sat quiet in the distance, its skyline a dark outline against a sky turning slowly from black to deep purple to the soft gray of early morning. 4 acres of land stretched out below him, manicured grass, a line of Georgia pines at the far edge of the property, and the still surface of a small pond catching the first pale light. He held his coffee mug in both hands and stood there for a long moment, not moving, just watching. The house behind him was something else entirely. 6,000 square feet of custom-built stone and glass, every angle and every room the product of his own hand on paper, before a single worker ever broke ground. He had drawn the original plans himself, at a drafting table in a one-room apartment 9 years ago. He had specified the materials, managed the timeline, and overseen every phase of construction personally. The kitchen windows faced east to catch the morning light. The terrace was poured at a slight slope, so rainwater drained clean. The stone around the fireplace came from a quarry in North Carolina that he'd visited twice before approving the order. Details. David Washington lived in details. His crew called him the General. Not because he was loud. He wasn't. David Washington had never needed to raise his voice on a job site in his life. They called him that because, when he walked through a half-finished building, he saw everything. The framing that was a 1/4 inch off. The subcontractor who had poured the footings too shallow. The window that would let water in 4 years from now if nobody fixed the flashing today. He saw it all before anyone else did, and he corrected it quietly and completely. And then he moved on. That same quality did not stay at the job site when he came home. He noticed the scarf first, 3 months ago, folded neatly over the towel bar in the guest bathroom. Soft gray cashmere that didn't belong to either of them. He'd pressed it lightly between 2 fingers and caught the smell immediately. A men's cologne, not his. He'd set the scarf back exactly as he found it and said nothing. He noticed the closet 4 weeks after that. Trish had always filled every inch of it. Shoes arranged by color, blouses organized by sleeve length, a whole section dedicated to the kind of dresses she wore to events David was expected to attend and smile through. Now there were gaps, not empty. She'd rearranged things to fill the visual space, but he could count what was missing. 2 suitcases, a garment bag, the good jewelry box replaced by a smaller one. He noticed the conversations most of all. 14 years of marriage gives a man a finely tuned ear for the difference between a real exchange and a performance. Trish was performing. Every dinner, every weekend morning, every brief interaction before she left for wherever she'd started spending her afternoons, all of it had the texture of lines delivered rather than words chosen. She was pleasant. She was composed. She asked him about the Buckhead project with the right amount of interest and listened to his answer with the right amount of attention. It was perfect. That was exactly the problem. The real Trish had always had edges. She pushed back. She had opinions about what he should wear to client dinners, and wasn't quiet about them. She complained when he worked Saturdays, and she meant it. And that realness, even when it grated, was at least honest. This new version of her was too smooth, too careful. She was managing him, and she had been for a while. He sipped his coffee and let the quiet settle around him. Washington Build and Development had just closed its largest contract in company history, a $47 million mixed-use development in downtown Atlanta. Retail on the ground floor, 8 floors of residential above, underground parking, and a rooftop terrace. The kind of project that takes a mid-sized firm and moves it into a different category entirely. His project manager had opened a bottle of bourbon in the office. His crew had cheered. His CFO, April Dorsey, had set the signed contract on his desk and said simply, "We earned this one." He had nodded and meant it. Professionally, everything was ascending. He could feel the momentum of it, the clean upward line of years of careful work finally reaching the altitude he'd always aimed for. Personally, something had gone wrong. He wasn't sure exactly when, but it had been building the way structural problems always build, invisible for a long time, obvious all at once, and never actually sudden. He finished his coffee and set the mug on the terrace railing. Back inside, through the kitchen, through the side door that opened into the garage, he flicked on the overhead light. His workbench ran the full length of the far wall, tools organized, surfaces clean. He crouched down and reached beneath the bench, into the narrow space between the lower shelf and the floor, and pulled out a manila envelope. It had been there for 3 weeks. He sat down on the stool beside the bench. He poured a second cup from the small coffee maker he kept out here and set it beside him. Then he opened the envelope and began to read. He went through every page, slowly, all the way to the end. Then he closed it. His face didn't change. His hands were steady. The coffee steamed quietly beside him. He had suspected most of it. He had suspected enough of it that hiring the investigator had felt less like a decision and more like a formality, a man confirming measurements he'd already taken by eye. Now he had the numbers. The Washington Build and Development offices sat on the 4th floor of a low-rise commercial building in Buckhead. Nothing flashy. Clean lines, good light, a small conference room with a whiteboard that was almost always full. David had chosen the space because it was practical, and because the parking was easy for his contractors to get in and out of. He didn't need an address that impressed people. His contracts did that. He arrived at 7:40. His assistant, Marcus, was already at his desk, with coffee and a printed schedule. David thanked him, took the schedule, and was halfway down the hall when Marcus called after him. "April asked me to let you know she needs a few minutes. Private," she said, "whenever you're settled." David looked back. "Tell her now is fine." He set his bag down in his office and walked directly to April's. Her door was closed. He knocked twice and opened it. April Dorsey was already sitting behind her desk, both hands folded on top of a manila folder. She was 37 years old, and had been with the company long enough that David didn't need to read her face for very long before he understood that what was in that folder was not routine. "Close the door," she said. He did. He sat down across from her without being asked. April was not a dramatic person. She didn't build to things. When she had good news, she stated it. When she had bad news, she stated that too. It was one of the reasons David trusted her more than almost anyone else he'd ever worked with. She didn't editorialize. She just laid out what was true. She opened the folder. "I want to walk you through this from the beginning," she said. "I've been looking at this for a while, and I wanted to make sure I had the complete picture before I brought it to you. Go ahead." She turned the first page toward him. It was a spreadsheet. Columns of dates, amounts, and account numbers, color-coded and annotated in April's precise hand. Over the last 22 months, money has been moving out of 3 of your joint personal accounts, she said. Not quickly, not in large amounts. Small transfers, spread out, timed carefully. She tapped the page. Every single one of these fell below the threshold that would trigger an automatic review, and every one of them was timed to land within a day or two of a significant company transaction, the kind that produces enough noise in the books that a smaller movement nearby doesn't stand out. David looked at the page. He didn't touch it. "Where did it go?" he asked. "A Delaware LLC," April said. "Halcyon Ventures, registered 14 months ago." She turned to the next page. "Trish Washington is listed as the sole member." The room was quiet for a moment. "How much?" David said. $614,000. He nodded slowly. He looked at the number on the page, and then he looked up at April. "That's not all of it," she said. She turned to the third page. It was a printed email, a forwarded message, the header showing it had arrived in Washington Build's property management inbox 6 months ago. "This came through the shared property inquiry address," April said. "Whoever sent it used an email account that had both a personal address and that inbox linked to it. An old setup, probably forgot it was still active. It's a property valuation request for Harmon Ridge." David picked up the page. The email was addressed to a firm he didn't recognize. He scanned to the signature line at the bottom of the thread. "Brendan Okafor, Okafor Legal Group." "I looked him up," April said. "His firm specializes in high-asset divorce litigation." David set the page down. He sat with that for a moment. The kind of moment that isn't really a moment at all. It's a whole series of things clicking into place simultaneously, each one finding the slot it was always meant to fill. "So she's had a lawyer for at least 6 months, he said. "That's when the email is dated," April said. "The transfers go back further. 22 months. David looked at her. "Does she know you found this?" April held his gaze. "No." "Does anyone else in this office know?" "No." He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he leaned back in the chair, just slightly, and said, "Don't change anything. Don't move anything. Don't close any accounts. Don't flag any transactions. We let it breathe." April nodded. If she had any reaction beyond that, she didn't show it. She closed the folder and set it to one side. "It'll be here when you need it," she said. That evening, David sat across from Trish at the kitchen table. She had made pasta, a thing she did when she was in a good mood or wanted to appear to be. She talked about a girlfriend's upcoming birthday event, some wine dinner at a restaurant in Midtown, and whether the dress code was cocktail or business casual. David listened. He asked the right questions. He refilled her water glass when it was low, and he watched her the way he watched blueprints, slowly, carefully, looking not for what was there, but for what wasn't where it was supposed to be. He saw it everywhere now. The courier arrived at 10:14 on a Tuesday morning. David was on the phone with a site manager when Marcus appeared in the doorway and held up a manila envelope with the particular expression of someone who doesn't know what's inside it but knows it isn't good news. David held up one finger, finished the call, and reached across the desk. He turned the envelope over. The return address was a Buckhead office suite. Okafor Legal Group. He opened it. He read the filing once, straight through, without stopping. Then he went back to the first page and read it again. The demands were laid out in clean legal language, the kind that was designed to feel inevitable. The Harmon Ridge estate, valued at $10.2 million. A lump sum of $2.1 million in liquid assets. Spousal support of $18,000 per month, ongoing. And 50% of Washington Build and Development's assessed value. 50%. David set the papers down on his desk. He straightened the edges against the surface, lining them up the way he lined up everything. Then he picked up his phone and called Uncle Roy. Roy answered on the second ring. "I need to come by tonight," David said. A beat of silence. "I'll put on coffee," Roy said, "or something stronger." Something stronger. He didn't go to Roy's that afternoon. First, he went home. Trish had texted him mid-afternoon asking if they could talk that evening at the house. She used the word talk the way people use it when they mean hear me explain a thing I have already decided. David replied that he'd be there by 7. She was already in the living room when he arrived. She had changed into something simple and composed. The kind of outfit that said, "I am a reasonable woman having a reasonable conversation." She had not poured wine. She had not made it comfortable. She was sitting with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and when David came in and sat down across from her, she began without a preamble. The marriage had run its course. She had tried, she made sure to say that. She had really tried, but they had grown into different people with different lives, and it was nobody's fault. She intended to stay in the house during the proceedings because that was the most practical arrangement. She hoped they could handle this maturely, without making it ugly. She used the word adults twice. She spoke for about 4 minutes. She had clearly practiced. Every sentence arrived where it was supposed to. David let her finish. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shift in his seat. He gave her the full length of every sentence without filling the pauses. And when she was done, and the room was quiet, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a single document on the coffee table between them. She looked down at it. It was a deed. One page, printed cleanly, the formatting of a legal instrument that had been sitting in a file folder for a long time, because it had never needed to be used before. "The Harmon Ridge property," David said, "is titled to HRW Holdings, LLC, Single-Member Limited Liability Company. I formed that entity 4 years before we were married." He kept his voice even. Not cold, not warm, just level, the way you describe a measurement. "The house was built by my company and transferred to HRW Holdings when construction was complete. It has never been in both of our names. It was never put into a joint trust. It was never commingled with any marital asset. Not once." Trish stared at the document. "Under Georgia law," David continued, "that property is separate. The claim your attorney filed this morning has no legal basis." She looked up at him. Something moved across her face. Not panic yet, but the early edge of it. The moment before a person fully understands what they're looking at. "Brendan's a divorce litigator," David said. "A good one, from what I understand." Which means he almost certainly knew that before he filed. "He let you walk into this demanding something you were never going to get." The room was very still. "We lived there," Trish said. Her voice had lost some of its rehearsed steadiness. "David, we lived there. That's our home. You can't just... Living somewhere doesn't change who holds the title. That's not fair. You know that's not fair." "The deed doesn't ask what's fair," he said. "It asks who owns it." She straightened in her seat. Her jaw tightened. "I want the house. I'm entitled to the house." David looked at her. He had known this woman for 16 years. He had watched her arrange and rearrange her world to fit an image she was always chasing. He had watched her get so close to something she wanted that she stopped being able to see it clearly. And then, quietly, he laughed. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't meant to wound. It was the laugh of a man who had just watched someone play their best card and turn it over to show a blank face. It came out of him the way a long breath comes out, naturally, with relief. "Trish," he said, standing up, "you can't get what was never yours." He left her at the table and walked to the garage. His workbench was along the far wall. He reached underneath it and pulled out the manila envelope, the one the private investigator had delivered 3 weeks ago, the one he'd opened and read before April ever sat down across from him and said the name Halcyon Ventures. He had already known about Brendan. He had been waiting to know everything. Roy's house sat on a quiet street in Decatur, a brick ranch with a covered porch and 2 oak trees out front that had been growing since before David was born. The porch light was on. It was always on when Roy knew someone was coming. David parked at the curb and sat for a moment. The street was the kind of quiet that only exists in older neighborhoods, the particular stillness of a block where people have been living long enough to stop making noise about it. He got out and walked up the front path. Roy opened the door before he knocked. "Figured you'd be later," Roy said, stepping back to let him in. "Drove straight here." Bourbon's on the table. The kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee and old wood. Roy's kitchen always smelled like that. There was a round table near the window where Roy had done most of his best thinking for the last 30 years, and tonight it had 2 glasses and a bottle of Knob Creek and a stack of folders bound together with a thick rubber band. David looked at the folders and then looked at Roy. Roy sat down and poured. "Sit." David sat. Roy pushed a glass toward him and picked up his own. He didn't toast anything. He just drank, set the glass down, and folded his hands on the table the way a man does when he's been waiting a long time to say something. "2 years ago," Roy said. "Your company picnic. The one out at Stone Mountain." David remembered it. Late summer. The whole crew, families included. "Trish spent about 45 minutes on her phone," Roy said. "Now I know people use their phones. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the way she turned away from the table every time she looked at the screen. The way she deflected when Marcus's wife asked about your new project." He paused. "I've been doing this long enough to know that when someone doesn't want to talk about your money, it's usually because they're already thinking about it differently than you are." David was quiet. "I didn't say anything then," Roy said. "Didn't have anything to say. Just a feeling. But I started paying attention." What Roy had noticed, over the 18 months that followed, was not dramatic. It was small. The jewelry, a diamond pendant David had given Trish for their 10th anniversary, a pair of earrings from a trip to Savannah, gone from the house without mention. He'd noticed their absence at Christmas, when she wore neither, and when he'd asked her later, she'd said she was having them cleaned. He'd known she wasn't. There was the car. A white Lexus she'd traded without telling David, purchasing a replacement through a private dealer in Alpharetta rather than a dealership. No financing. Cash transaction. Roy had found the record through a vehicle title search. There was the savings bond portfolio. Conservative investments Trish had accumulated over 10 years. Bonds purchased incrementally. Roy had been helping David do basic annual reviews of their joint financial picture for years. And 14 months ago, the bonds simply weren't there when he'd pulled the report. "I estimate she converted somewhere between $80,000 and $90,000 into untraceable cash over about 18 months, Roy said. He said it plainly, the way accountants state numbers. That's conservative. Could be a little more. David looked at the folders on the table. "There's something else," Roy said, and his voice shifted, not softer, but more careful. "About 8 months ago, Trish took a personal loan against the Cascade Road investment property, the one you and she held jointly." David went still. "She encumbered the asset without your signature," Roy said. "I don't know how she got the loan processed, but I've seen the lien filing. Your name is not on it. You didn't authorize it." He let that sit for a moment. "That's not a gray area, David. That's unauthorized encumbrance of a jointly held asset." The number Roy laid out next was not $614,000. That was April's number. Clean, documented, the Halcyon Ventures figure. Roy's reconstruction was the complete picture. The $614,000 from the transfers April had traced, the liquidated personal assets, the unauthorized loan. Total comes to approximately $887,000, Roy said. "Give or take a few thousand depending on some bond valuations I'm still confirming." He slid the bound folders across the table. David picked them up and opened the first one. Roy had organized everything the way he organized everything. chronologically, source notated, cross-referenced. Each transfer had a corresponding record. Each asset liquidation had a corresponding trace. It was the work of a man who had spent 4 decades making sure numbers told true stories. David went through it, page by page. He didn't rush. He read the way he always read. Fully, twice in some places, the way you read a contract before you sign it. When he closed the last folder, he looked up. "I need you to formalize everything," he said. "Notarize every document." "Already scheduled for Thursday," Roy said. David nodded. He looked down at the folders in his hands, then back at his uncle. "You've been sitting on this." "I was building it," Roy said. "There's a difference." David held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded again. Slower this time. The answer was enough. He finished his bourbon. Roy didn't pour another. David left Roy's house with the ledger under his arm. He walked to his truck, got in, and sat in the driveway for a moment with the engine off. Through the windshield, the porch light was still on. He started the truck and pulled out toward the city. His face was still, his hands easy on the wheel. He had the number now. He had the documentation. He had the full shape of what had been taken, and how. What he didn't have yet was the full shape of how it had been built. The legal architecture behind Halcyon Ventures, the structure Brendan Okafor had designed to keep himself clean, while Trish held every piece of paper with her name on it. That was the next thing to understand. Victor Ashe's office sat on the 14th floor of a glass building off Peachtree Road in Buckhead. The view from his conference room looked out over the city, a wide spread of rooftops and highways and morning haze burning off in the early sun. David had been in this room before. He knew what it meant when Victor cleared his schedule for a morning meeting with no assistant in the room. David set Roy's bound ledger and April's documentation packet on the conference table and sat down. Victor picked up the ledger first. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, with close-cut gray at his temples, and reading glasses he wore low on his nose. He did not speak when he read. He never did. He turned pages with the same steady rhythm, pausing occasionally to flip back and cross-reference something, and the room was quiet except for the sound of paper and the distant hum of the city 14 floors below. David waited. He was good at waiting. Victor moved from Roy's ledger to April's documentation without comment. He read through the Halcyon Ventures transfer records, the Delaware LLC registration, the timing analysis April had built showing each transfer positioned against large company transaction. He reviewed the property valuation email that had landed in the wrong inbox. He read everything once. Then he went back and read 2 sections again. He set the stack down and took off his glasses. Before he could speak, David's phone buzzed on the table. April. David picked it up. "Go ahead." Her voice was level, the way it got when she was delivering something serious and didn't want the weight of it to show. "I found something this morning I need you to hear. I'm listening. 8 months ago, there was a transfer out of the primary operating account. Washington billed. $212,000. She paused. "It went into Halcyon Ventures." David did not move. "She used the power of attorney," April said. "The one you signed about 6 years ago for routine business. Property closings, vendor agreements. I have the authorization paperwork. Her signature is on the transfer request. The POA is attached." Another pause. "David, this wasn't your personal money. This wasn't joint money. This was company capital." He set the phone on the table and put it on speaker. "Say that again for Victor," he said. April repeated it. All of it. Victor listened with his hands flat on the table. When April finished, Victor looked at David over the top of his glasses. "Is she still on the line?" "I'm here," April said. "The POA documentation. You have the original instrument, the transfer request, and the Halcyon Ventures receiving record. All 3, time-stamped. I can have them to you within the hour." "Send them now," Victor said. The line was quiet for a moment while April pulled the files. David looked out the window. A plane was crossing the sky in the distance, small and slow against the blue. "Sent," April said. Victor's laptop was already open. He pulled the documents up and read through them at the table without getting up. It took him 4 minutes. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at David directly. "She handed you the entire case," he said. It wasn't relief in his voice. It was the flat certainty of a man reading coordinates. The Halcyon Ventures transfers were always going to be a fight. Marital fraud, contested assets. Her attorneys argue commingling. It gets messy. But this? He tapped the screen. This is theft of business funds. This is not a divorce matter. This is a civil tort. Potentially, a criminal one. David nodded. The power of attorney she used was scoped for routine transactions, Victor continued. Property closings, vendor agreements. A $212,000 transfer from a business operating account into a private LLC she controlled is not within that scope by any reasonable reading. She exceeded her authority significantly. He paused. And she did it while actively planning a divorce, with the help of an attorney who specializes in high-asset proceedings. He let that last sentence stay in the room. "Which brings me to Brendan Okafor," Victor said. "If his guidance to her on structuring Halcyon Ventures is documented anywhere, emails, correspondence, billing records, he has direct exposure. An attorney who coaches a client through the fraudulent movement of funds during divorce planning isn't just a witness. He's a participant." David looked at him. "Can we document it?" "That depends on what we can recover." Victor folded his hands. "But here's what I know. Sophisticated attorneys make the mistake of being thorough in writing. It's the habit of the profession. And thorough documentation of a bad idea is still documentation of a bad idea." David was quiet for a moment. "Prepare the civil complaint, but don't file anything." Victor's expression didn't change. "We have enough to move now." "I know," David said. "I want 30 more days. I want his full paper trail before we put anything on record." Victor looked at him for a beat, then nodded once. That was enough. David rode the elevator down alone and walked out into the Buckhead morning. The air was warm and smelled like exhaust and cut grass from the median strip along Peachtree. He pulled out his phone and called April. She picked up on the first ring. "Pull every email and communication you can legally recover," he said. "Anything connected to Halcyon Ventures. Anything touching that power of attorney transaction. Everything." The lake house sat on a quiet stretch of water 2 hours north of Atlanta, tucked back from the shoreline behind a row of old pines. It belonged to a colleague of Brendan's, a tax attorney who kept it available for the right people. Brendan had called it a weekend away. Trish called it a reward. She didn't see much difference between the two. She stood at the kitchen window Friday evening with a glass of red wine, watching the last of the sunset flatten out across the water. The light was orange and slow. The pines were black against it. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, maybe years. And it took her a moment to name it. Relief. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter. The specific feeling of a decision already made. A direction already chosen, a life already in motion. She had been building toward this for 2 years. Now it was simply a matter of time. Brendan came in from the back porch carrying his own glass and set it on the counter beside her. He looked good in the lake light. Relaxed in a way he wasn't in Atlanta. His jacket off, collar open, the careful professional composure softened at the edges. This was the version of him she had bet on. The version that made the plan feel not just necessary, but correct. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm thinking." "About the case?" "About after," she said. He smiled. "After's going to be good." They ate dinner at the long oak table by the windows. Steaks Brendan had driven up in a cooler, a bottle of wine she'd chosen herself, and the conversation moved easily between the future she was picturing and the present he was managing. "How much longer?" she asked, not for the first time. Brendan cut a piece of steak. "Cases like this take time. That's normal. His team is stalling. It's a standard delay tactic when the other side knows they're negotiating from behind. File objections, request extensions, slow everything down, and hope we blink." He set down his knife. "We don't blink." "The house," Trish said, "will be contested. I told you that from the start." He reached across the table and set his hand briefly over hers. "But contested doesn't mean lost. It means argued. And I am very good at arguing." Trish nodded. She had heard this before. She believed it because she had no reason not to, and because belief was easier than doubt when the plan was already in motion. She thought about the downtown condo she'd been watching online. A 2-bedroom on the 16th floor of a building in Midtown, floor-to-ceiling windows, a kitchen she would actually use. She thought about mornings without the particular heaviness that had settled over the house on Harmon Ridge. Not David, specifically. The marriage. The weight of something she'd outgrown years ago and stayed inside anyway, telling herself patience was the same as strategy. She thought about what financial independence actually felt like as a concept versus a lived reality, and she decided it felt like this: a lake house on a Friday, a man across the table who'd chosen her, a life she had moved toward deliberately rather than stumbled into. "The spousal support request," she said, "is strong," Brendan said. 14 years of marriage, significant disparity in income, documented lifestyle. Judges take that seriously. He lifted his glass. "Relax, Trish. We're in good shape." She lifted hers. She did not know that April Dorsey had spent that same week pulling every recoverable email from the server trail connected to Halcyon Ventures. She did not know that 2 of those emails, between Brendan and a paralegal at his firm, laid out, in careful professional language, the structural logic behind timing the Halcyon Ventures transfers against large company transactions to minimize detection. She did not know that Victor Ashe had read those emails, clipped them to a formal complaint letter, and submitted them to the Georgia State Bar 4 days ago. She did not know about the $212,000. She did not know that a sealed civil complaint with her name on it was sitting in a file on Victor's desk, fully drafted, waiting only for the word. She refilled her wine and looked out at the dark water. The moon had come up. The pines were still. She felt, in that moment, genuinely at peace. That same Saturday morning, 2 hours south, David Washington was standing at the edge of his commercial development site in downtown Atlanta. The steel frame was going up fast, faster than projected, and the sound of it filled the whole block. Bolts and cable and men calling to each other across open air. He had his hard hat on and a set of revised drawings under his arm and a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. His site foreman, Marcus, came up beside him and looked at the frame rising against the sky. "We're running 9 days ahead," Marcus said. He sounded almost surprised. David looked up at the steel. "That's because the foundation was laid correctly the first time," he said. Marcus nodded like that was the whole answer. Because it was. Monday morning, David was at his desk by 6:30. He opened Victor's completed civil complaint and read through it one final time. Every page, every figure, every legal citation. He read it the way he read everything. Once for the content, once for what wasn't there. Nothing was missing. He picked up his phone and called Victor. "Now we're ready," he said. Victor Ashe's office was on the 14th floor of a building in Buckhead. Floor-to-ceiling windows, clean lines. The kind of space that said serious money without having to announce it. David had always appreciated that about Victor. The man let his work speak and kept everything else quiet. Roy was already there when David arrived, sitting in one of the leather chairs across from Victor's desk, with a thermos of coffee and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. April was on the speakerphone in the center of the table, her voice clear and steady from the company office downtown. Victor stood when David walked in. He didn't waste time on small talk. "Sit down," he said. "We have a lot to cover." He opened a thick manila folder and set it flat on the desk. Behind it, a second folder, then a third. David sat. He folded his hands. He waited. Victor began at the top. The Harmon Ridge property. He placed a single document in front of David, the HRW Holdings Formation Certificate, dated 4 years before David and Trish were married. Her claim has no legal foundation. The property was constructed by Washington Build and transferred to HRW Holdings upon completion. It has never been jointly titled, never placed in a marital trust, never commingled with a single shared account. Victor looked up. Under Georgia law, this is separate property. Full stop. There is nothing to argue. Roy made a quiet sound. Not quite a laugh. Not quite not one either. She didn't do her homework, Roy said. Her attorney did, Victor said. Which is worse. Brendan Okafor knew the house was a losing claim before he ever filed it. David said nothing. He already knew. He let Victor keep moving. The financial fraud. Victor opened the second folder. Roy's reconstruction gives us the complete picture. 26 months of documented activity across 5 accounts and 3 asset categories. He turned the folder so David could see the summary page. The number at the bottom was printed in plain black type. $817,400. Joint personal accounts, Victor continued, moving down the page with one finger. Halcyon Ventures transfers, $614,000, structured to avoid automatic review triggers, timed against large company transactions. He paused. Roy, the asset liquidations. Roy leaned forward. 81,000, roughly. Jewelry, a vehicle, a savings bond portfolio, all converted to cash over 18 months. She was careful. No single transaction was large enough to raise flags. He picked up his thermos. But patterns don't care about being careful. Patterns just are. Victor nodded. And the investment property loan, unauthorized encumbrance against a jointly held asset. No co-signature, no disclosure. Another $32,000. He closed the second folder. Every dollar is documented, sourced, and legally classified. Then there's the company transfer, April said through the phone. Her voice was even, precise. $212,000 out of a Washington Build operating account into Halcyon Ventures, using a power of attorney David signed for routine business purposes. She used it to move company capital into her personal LLC. A beat. That's not a marital dispute. That's theft. The word sat in the room for a moment. Victor let it sit. Then he opened the third folder. Brendan Okafor. He set 2 printed emails on the desk, side by side. These are recoverable communications between Brendan and a paralegal at his firm. April's server trace pulled them from the property management inbox thread. He tapped the first email. This one discusses timing the Halcyon Ventures transfers against large company transactions. His language, his instruction, his reasoning. He advised Trish on how to move the money in a way that would be difficult to detect. He tapped the second. This one discusses the structure of the LLC itself. Delaware registration, sole member designation, the specific reason Trish's name appears, and his does not. Roy looked at the emails. His jaw shifted. He kept himself clean, Roy said. He tried to, Victor said. His name isn't on the LLC. His name isn't on any of the accounts. He designed it that way deliberately. He looked at David. Which means, if this went criminal, Trish holds the exposure, not Brendan. David looked at the emails. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. He used her, he said finally. It wasn't a question. Structurally, yes. She believed she was executing a plan they built together. Legally, she's the one holding the liability. Victor sat back. I've already submitted both emails to the Georgia State Bar as part of a formal complaint. That process will run its own course, separate from the divorce, but it will run. David nodded slowly. Now, Victor said. The question of criminal charges on the 212. David looked up. The company transfer is prosecutable, Victor said. Fraud at this level, with this documentation, a DA would take it. But criminal proceedings mean a different timeline, a different process, and significantly less control over how the outcome shapes. David's voice was quiet. Does criminal prosecution give me more control over how this ends, or less? Victor didn't hesitate. Less? Then we don't go criminal. David set both hands flat on the desk. We go civil, total, comprehensive. Victor allowed himself a small nod. The nod of a man who had hoped to hear exactly that. He reached for a fourth folder, thinner than the others. Then here's how we move, he said. 3 stages. The divorce hearing before Judge Osei, where the House claim would be dismantled on the record, and the civil fraud documentation would be formally introduced. A private mediation session. Just David, Trish, and their attorneys, where David would present the full ledger directly, and a final conversation that left no ambiguity about where things stood or what had been done. I file the civil complaint tomorrow morning, Victor said. File it, David said. He drove home in the early evening. The city gave way to the wider roads that climbed toward Harmon Ridge, and by the time he pulled through the gate, the sun was already behind the tree line. He walked through the house without turning on many lights, through the entryway, through the main hall, past the kitchen, and out through the back doors onto the terrace. The property stretched out in front of him in the gray-blue of early dusk. 4 acres. Old hardwoods along the north edge. The lawn sloping gently toward the tree line. He had stood on this exact spot 100 times. With blueprints, with his crew, with coffee, with nothing at all. He had stood here before. There was a house to stand behind, when this was still raw Georgia clay and survey stakes, and a plan that existed only in his head. He remembered pouring the foundation, the specific weight of that work, the decisions that went into it, the depth, the reinforcement, the load calculations, the legal structure that would protect everything built on top of it before a single wall went up. He had made those decisions carefully, quietly, without anyone watching. He stood there now and looked out at what those decisions had become. He did not feel triumphant. Not yet. He felt ready. The Fulton County Family Court building sat on a block in downtown Atlanta that had no interest in being impressive. Beige stone, fluorescent hallways, the smell of recycled air and old paper. It was the kind of place where the furniture had been replaced twice and the carpet never had. David had been in rooms like this before. Permit offices, zoning boards, county assessors. Rooms where decisions got made by people holding clipboards and case numbers. He knew how to be still in rooms like this. He and Victor arrived 20 minutes early. Victor set the banker's box on the table without ceremony, aligned his folders, and reviewed his notes. David sat beside him with his hands folded and his expression the same as it was every morning on the terrace, quiet, present, unhurried. He wore a dark gray suit he'd bought 2 years ago for a contract signing. It still fit. He hadn't needed to buy anything new for this. Brendan and Trish came in together. That was the first thing David noticed. Not that they arrived at the same time, that they arrived together. Brendan's hand rested briefly at the small of Trish's back as they moved through the courtroom door. It was a small gesture, private, the kind of thing a person does without thinking because they've done it enough times for it to become muscle memory. Judge Helen Osei noticed it too. She was already at the bench, reviewing documents, her reading glasses low on her nose. She looked up when Brendan and Trish entered. Her expression didn't shift. But she looked, and she catalogued it, and David had the sense that nothing in this courtroom went unregistered by the woman behind that bench. Judge Osei was 58 years old and had been presiding over family court for 14 years. She had a reputation for 2 things: patience and zero tolerance for legal theater. Victor had told David the first time they discussed her, that she was the best possible judge for this case. "She reads the room before she reads the briefs," Victor had said. "And she reads the briefs very carefully." Brendan opened for Trish's side. He was good. David would give him that. His voice was measured and confident. His posture relaxed without being casual. He presented the Harmon Ridge claim with the smooth authority of a man who had made arguments like this in rooms like this many times before. He spoke about the 14-year marriage, the shared life built within those walls, the principle of marital contribution, that Trish had maintained the home, managed the household, and supported David's professional ascent throughout the partnership. He asked the court to recognize Harmon Ridge as a marital asset. Victor let him finish. Then he stood up. He placed 3 documents in front of Judge Osei. The HRW Holdings LLC formation certificate, dated, notarized, filed with the state of Georgia 4 years before David and Trish Washington's marriage. The deed to the Harmon Ridge property, transferring ownership from Washington Build and Development to HRW Holdings upon completion of construction. And a 1-page Georgia property law brief, annotated with the relevant statutes underlined in clean black ink. The property at Harmon Ridge, Victor said, was never a marital asset. It was designed, constructed, and titled as the sole property of HRW Holdings LLC before this marriage existed. It was never jointly titled, never placed in a marital trust, never commingled with any shared account at any point during the marriage. Under Georgia law, this is separate property. There is no marital claim to adjudicate. Brendan raised 3 counterarguments: transmutation by cohabitation, implied contribution to equity, unjust enrichment. Victor answered each one. Not quickly, deliberately. He took exactly the time each response required, and not 1 second more. When he finished the 3rd, he sat down. Judge Osei didn't confer with anyone. She didn't take a recess. She looked at the documents in front of her, looked at Victor, and sustained the objection to the property claim in 2 sentences. The $10.2 million left Trish's future in the time it took to say it. David didn't look at Trish. He was watching Judge Osei, but he felt the shift in the room, the way the air changed on that side of the aisle. He'd felt that sensation before, on job sites, in the seconds after a structural calculation proved out, and everyone in the room understood at the same moment that the load would hold. Victor stood again. He placed the civil fraud complaint on the table, then Roy's ledger, the complete $887,400 reconstruction, every transaction documented, sourced, and classified. Then the $212,000 company transfer records, flagged and annotated by April. He asked the court to take documented fraudulent asset dissipation into account in any future settlement determination. Judge Osei picked up the ledger. She turned pages slowly. Her face gave nothing away, but she read carefully, more carefully than the room expected, her glasses moving slightly as her eyes tracked down each column. After several minutes, she set it down and scheduled a follow-up hearing. She asked that both parties' counsel submit supplemental briefs within 15 days. Then she called a recess. In the hallway, Brendan pulled Trish a few steps away from the courtroom doors. His voice was low and controlled. The house was always a long shot. You need to prepare yourself for a reduced settlement. The support request is still strong. We focus there. Trish looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at a sentence you've read 3 times and finally understood. A long shot. He had told her, months ago, that the house was hers. He had said it with the same measured confidence he'd used inside. He had coached her through every conversation, every prepared response, every moment of the last 6 months. And now he was standing in a courthouse hallway, telling her it was a long shot. Those were not words chosen to comfort her. Those were words chosen to cover him. Court adjourned for the day at 4:15. David walked out with Victor beside him. He did not glance toward Trish. he did not slow down. He carried nothing from the courtroom except what he'd brought in: his posture, his quiet, his sense of exactly where things stood. Trish watched him go. She stood near the courtroom door and watched David Washington walk down the hallway without looking back. And for the first time in 6 months, the first real, unguarded moment since any of this began, she felt something cold and clarifying move through her. She had spent 14 years believing she understood this man. She was no longer sure she had ever known him at all. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street that belonged to a neutral mediation firm neither side had a relationship with. That was Victor's doing. He wanted no home field advantage for anyone, no familiar carpet, no friendly receptionist, just a long table, 8 chairs, and a view of downtown Atlanta that nobody was going to enjoy. David arrived first. He set his binder on the table, poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher at the center, and sat down. He did not check his phone. He did not review his notes. He had already reviewed everything. He just sat and looked at the city through the glass. Victor arrived 2 minutes later. He arranged his folders, checked the recorder. They had agreed, in writing, that the session would be recorded, and took his seat to David's left. Trish and Brendan came in together again, 4 days in a row now. It was becoming a pattern that had stopped meaning what she probably intended it to mean. Trish had dressed carefully. Cream blouse, dark slacks, hair pulled back. She looked composed, prepared. She looked, David thought, like a woman who had convinced herself this was still a negotiation she could shape. She sat across from him and set her hands flat on the table. Brendan sat to her right, opened his portfolio, and clicked his pen once. "We appreciate the willingness to mediate," Brendan said. "I think there's a reasonable path to resolution here that works for everyone." David nodded. He reached over and opened his binder. "I'm going to read through some numbers," he said. "I'd appreciate it if everyone just let me finish." His voice was even, not cold, even. The way a man sounds when he is reading something he has read many times and no longer needs to perform any reaction to. He started at the beginning. March 14th, 22 months ago. Joint savings account ending in 4471. Transfer of $9,800 to Halcyon Ventures, LLC. Delaware registration. He turned the page. March 29th. Joint checking account ending in 2209. Transfer of $8,500. Same destination. He read every entry. There were 41 of them. He read each one the same way. Date, account, amount, destination. No commentary, no editorial. Just the numbers and the dates, steady and patient, like a man reading the measurements off a blueprint. The room was very quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the building's air system and the soft sound of a page turning every 30 seconds. Trish's hands stayed flat on the table. But by the 12th entry, something in her posture had changed. A tightness across the shoulders, a stillness that was different from composure. It was the stillness of someone trying not to move. Brendan's pen had stopped clicking. David reached the final Halcyon transfer and turned the page without pausing. In addition to the Halcyon Ventures transfers totaling $614,000, he said, there is an unauthorized personal loan taken against the jointly held Riverside investment property. Principal amount, $61,000, taken without my knowledge or signature. He looked up briefly, then back down. And there is a separate transaction, 8 months ago. A transfer of $212,000 from a Washington Build and Development operating account into Halcyon Ventures, executed using a power of attorney I signed for routine business purposes. He turned another page. That one, he said, is not a marital dispute. That is a business account. That is my company's money. He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then he moved on. He placed a printed email thread on the table and slid it to the center. Not to Trish, not to Brendan. just to the center, where everyone could see it. These are communications between Brendan Okafor and a paralegal at his firm, David said. They discuss the structuring of Halcyon Ventures in detail, specifically how to time the transfers and keep them below automatic review thresholds. They also reference the Harmon Ridge property. He tapped the third page of the thread. Right here, Brendan notes, and I'm quoting directly, that the Ridge claim is primarily a pressure instrument and should not be expected to survive a deed challenge. The room did not make a sound. He knew, David said, before you ever filed, that the house was never something you could get. He knew it, and he let you demand it anyway. He looked at Trish for the first time since he'd started reading. His voice didn't change. Halcyon Ventures is registered in your name. Only your name. He advised you on how to structure it, coached you on the transfers, and made sure there is no legal document anywhere with his name on it as a participant. He is your attorney of record. That is all he is on paper. He paused. If this goes criminal, and it can go criminal, based on the company transfer alone, the liable party is the sole member of Halcyon Ventures. He let her work out the rest herself. Silence filled the room like water filling a low space. Slow, complete, finding every corner. Brendan was looking at the table, not at the email thread, not at Trish. At the table. David reached into the binder and produced the settlement document. He placed it in front of Trish. One copy, one pen, already uncapped, set beside it. This recovers the full $887,000 through asset forfeiture and a structured payment arrangement, he said. Victor's office worked the numbers so that what remains leaves you enough that no court will call it punitive. He folded his hands. You sign this, and we're finished. You don't sign it, and we go back to Judge Ossie with everything on that table. He sat back. Trish looked at the document. Then she looked at Brendan. Brendan was reading the settlement. His eyes moved down the page with the focused, careful attention of a man doing a specific kind of math. The kind where the only variable he was solving for was himself. Trish picked up the pen and signed. 18 months. That was how long it took for everything to settle. The legal proceedings, the payments, the professional fallout, the quiet collapse of the life Trish and Brendan had planned together. 18 months for all of it to run its course and come to rest. Not with a crash, just a slow settling, the way a building shifts into its foundation after the construction crew goes home. David stood on the back terrace of Harmon Ridge at dawn, coffee in hand, looking out at the same 4 acres he had looked at the morning this whole thing began. The sky was the same pale gray bleeding into orange. The tree line was the same dark edge against the light. The air had the same cool bite that Atlanta mornings carry in early spring, before the heat gets serious. The house was quieter now. He didn't mind it. He had expected to mind it more than he did. The bar complaint against Brendan had taken 7 months to resolve. 7 months of investigation, written responses, procedural filings, and a formal hearing before the Georgia State Bar's disciplinary committee. At the end of it, Brendan received a formal censure and a 90-day suspension of his license to practice. 90 days doesn't sound like much. For a man whose boutique firm ran on his personal reputation as a clean, aggressive litigator, 90 days was the kind of wound that doesn't close. 2 of his 3 partners were gone within 8 months of the suspension. Major clients, the kind who needed continuous active representation and couldn't afford a suspended attorney as their lead counsel, quietly moved their business elsewhere. The firm that Brendan had spent 12 years building on the strength of his name and his wins lost roughly 40% of its revenue inside a year. David didn't track this obsessively. He just knew it the way you know weather. Not because you're watching the sky every minute, but because you step outside and feel the temperature. Trish and Brendan did not survive the weight of what the plan had cost them. A relationship built on the premise of a scheme that collapsed had nothing underneath it once the scheme was gone. They separated quietly, without announcement, sometime around the 10th month. David heard this second-hand, from someone at a mutual acquaintances gathering. He nodded when he heard it and moved on to the next conversation. Trish satisfied the structured settlement payments, every installment, on schedule, because the alternative was returning to Judge Osei's courtroom with a contempt motion and a man like Victor Ashe sitting across the table. The payments took everything she had accumulated and then some. What she had left when the last one cleared was a life smaller than the one she had walked away from 14 years ago. Smaller, quieter, and built on ground she had cleared herself. David didn't celebrate that either. He just noted it, the way you note a column of numbers that finally balances. April received her equity stake on a Tuesday morning in December, 3 months after the divorce was finalized. David had Victor draw up the restructured ownership documents and then called April into his office. Door open this time. No drama required. He slid the documents across the desk. She looked at the numbers. Then she looked at him. "David, you built this company the same as I did," he said. "The paperwork should reflect that." She didn't argue. She signed. When she left his office, she closed the door behind her with more care than usual, and David understood she needed a moment, and he gave it to her. Roy came for Sunday dinner twice a month now, regular as the calendar. He brought bourbon on the first Sunday and sweet tea on the third, and he stayed until the conversation ran out, which was usually late. They talked about the company, about the Southwest Atlanta project, about Roy's neighbor's ongoing war with a particular species of bird that had decided to nest in his gutters. They did not talk much about Trish. There was nothing left to say about Trish that Roy's ledger hadn't already said more precisely. Washington Build and Development closed the $47 million commercial project in October. On time, under budget, the way David built everything. 2 new residential developments broke ground the following spring. One of them was a mixed-income community in a Southwest Atlanta neighborhood that had been waiting for someone to look at it and see what it could be rather than what it was. Company revenue was up 34% year over year. David was 44 years old, clear-eyed, self-made, and entirely unbothered. He came in from the terrace when the sky had gone full light. He set his coffee cup in the sink, walked to his drafting table, and looked at the architectural plans spread across it. The Southwest Atlanta project. Foundations drawn clean and precise, every line exactly where it needed to be. He picked up his pencil. He thought for just a moment about what this house had always been. Not the marriage, not the image Trish had wanted to wear it like, not the asset someone had tried to take from him, the foundation, and a man who builds his own foundation from the ground up, from the first stake in the dirt to the last yard of concrete, doesn't lose it to someone who never once picked up a shovel. He set the pencil to the paper and got back to work. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.